no policy is going to develop without conversations, without discussion. And so to the extent that these protests are raising this issue to be discussed and to be debated, I think ultimately that's how you make policy. That's how democracy works. Well, I think clearly it's getting the attention of the world. I think here in the United States, folks are paying attention in a way that they weren't. So there's no question that these protests, that these acts in part of civil disobedience have raised the profile of these particular issues and had a major impact on campuses across the country where they're happening, from changes to graduation speakers to going online. I think it's beyond dispute that these have had an impact of raising awareness around this particular issue. Where it ultimately leads in terms of policy, I think we don't know, but there's no question that this has raised or increased the profile of this issue here in the United States and around the world. A couple of important points. From the perspective of the First Amendment, which is the amendment to the U.S. Constitution that protects the freedom of speech, the ability to peaceably assemble, what those rights are really is going to depend on what campus an individual is protesting on, because the First Amendment only applies to state action. So the First Amendment is only going to come into play largely if we're talking about protests on state university campuses. If we're talking about private colleges and universities, then the individuals who are engaging in protest there aren't going to be protected by the First Amendment because they're private institutions. And so that's the first distinction that I think is really important to understand about the application of the First Amendment right to protest, to free speech, to peaceably assemble. It really depends on whether it's a private institution or a state or public institution. And then the second thing, and I think this gets to your question, there's no doubt that in the United States, there's been a long history of engaging in what is called civil disobedience to raise awareness around issues, whether you talk about the Vietnam War, the civil rights movement, the LGBTQ movement, the environmental movement. In all of those, you've had instances of civil disobedience, which is by definition violating civil laws for the purposes of raising awareness. So there's no doubt that there's a history of that in the United States. But I think it's important to point out that civil disobedience is largely not protected by the First Amendment, which protects the freedom of speech. In some instances, it does protect conduct that's expressive, but things like barricading oneself into a campus building, occupying a campus building, those sorts of things aren't going to be protected by the First Amendment. Those are what we'd call civil disobedience, and as I said, have a history in the United States of being part of many social movements, but are simply not protected by the First Amendment. To my mind, as somebody that believes deeply in the First Amendment, the freedom of peaceful protest as a method of making change, I think part of any academic institution of higher learning must embrace the freedom of speech, the freedom to peaceably assemble. That, to me, is part of being a student at a university. And so I think that's a really important and critical point. On the other hand, there, of course, is a tension, and when free expression, protest, crosses that line and becomes something other than peaceable assembly, then you're moving into, as I said, civil disobedience. And that tension exists between trying to have a learning environment that's conducive to learning while also respecting those First Amendment values. And so I think there's a tension there, and those are always the most difficult sort of cases for courts to deal with. But I think the fact remains, it really is going to come down to, from a First Amendment perspective, are these protests taking place on private universities or state universities? And the private universities are going to have much more flexibility in terms of how they enforce and ultimately can prohibit even expressive conduct and free speech. State universities and institutions are going to have to comply with the First Amendment, which of course allows for the freedom of speech, the freedom of expression, the right to peaceably assemble. And so that's where I think we're seeing, in some instances, that peaceable assembly happening. In other places, we're seeing civil disobedience. We're seeing folks, close themselves into buildings, taking over office spaces. And I think that's the tension that I think both the protesters and the administrations at these universities are trying to navigate. And it's not an easy thing to navigate, but I think that's where we're at. Well, I think, look, from a First Amendment perspective, if we're talking about administrations at state universities or colleges, then they're going to have to comply with the First Amendment requirements. That doesn't mean they can't have what we call reasonable time, place, and manner restrictions on protests, on speech, right? And so the idea here is you're not going to be able to block a campus building or occupy a street indefinitely, right? Reasonable time, place, and manner restrictions, even under the First Amendment, would allow for prohibiting those sorts of behaviors. But the First Amendment certainly protects political speech. And so when you're talking about some of these very difficult political, social issues, that to me is at the core of what the First Amendment protects, right? Political discourse. That's why the First Amendment exists largely, is to create a place where we can have a debate, we can have a marketplace of ideas, and through that system, come to some agreement in terms of policy. It's messy, it can be chaotic at times, but I think the alternative is far worse. So I think it's very important that administrations and protesters alike recognize these First Amendment values that are at stake, regardless of the issue that's being debated, regardless of the policy that's being discussed. It really is fundamental to the U.S. Constitution. It's not that they're entirely unprotected by the First Amendment. What I mean is, if a private institution wants to enforce, a policy that says, we aren't going to allow people to protest on the campus green, right, or on campus property, they aren't going to be subject to the requirements of the First Amendment, because the First Amendment only applies to state action. And a private institution, a private university or private college is not the state. And so they're going to have much more flexibility in terms of how they enforce their law, their rules around student behavior. And so it's not that the students have no recourse. Certainly most private institutions have policies that embrace the First Amendment. But those are policies and they're not the Constitution itself. And I know that seems a little odd, but that's how the courts have interpreted the application of the Bill of Rights, which includes the First Amendment. You need a state actor, essentially, to be engaging in something that ostensibly violates the First Amendment in order to have First Amendment issues. So if we're talking about private institutions, there isn't going to be a constitutional protection when it comes to enforcement of those private institutions' rules against students, against protesters on those private campuses. These activities on campuses across the country have gotten the attention of the U.S. government and up to President Biden commenting on it. I think this has become an international news event. And so there's no doubt that this has raised awareness around these issues. Ultimately, I think if you look at history, these sorts of civil disobedient acts in some cases and peaceful protests in others have had different impacts depending on the issue. Sometimes the public turns away from it and becomes, upset over say civil disobedience occupying college buildings. Other times it helps raise awareness and move policy in a different direction. But I think no policy is going to develop without conversations, without discussion. And so to the extent that these protests are raising this issue to be discussed and to be debated, I think ultimately that's how you make policy. That's how democracy works.